In panel one, we addressed existing use cases. And the idea of panel two is, the intention is to discuss from a more strategic perspective drivers and demands for the use of GEMS, maps, and models. Also making specific reference to the global disaster risk reduction framework, initiatives like the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction and related initiatives. And to discuss this question, we have here a distinguished panel with two representatives from working actively for such global initiatives. First one is Emma Phillips from the Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction of the World Bank. And as a GFDR, Emma is in charge of several projects and initiatives, like the Understanding Risk Initiative, the Challenge Fund, which is co-financed by DFID, and she is also in charge of open data, of an open data strategy for disaster resilience. And so there are quite obvious interfaces with GEM. Then we have Ricardo Mena, who is at UN ISDR, the UN International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction, responsible for the implementation of the Sendai framework. Then we have Dicky Whittaker. Dicky made a career with various modeling companies, commercial modeling companies, but then at some point he developed an interest for a more open approach to risk modeling, and that led him to create, together with the late Peter Taylor, the OASIS loss modeling framework. But Dicky has here on this panel, he has a double hat. Dicky is also very much involved in the Insurance Development Forum, which is a public-private partnership which also tries to close this protection gap, or to support closing the protection gap, which has been discussed by Hector in his presentation before. And finally, we have Gary Maybury, working for a national aid organization, the US Agency for International Development, working all over the world. USAID has been a very important GEM partner for a long time, and has financed, for instance, the South American project, regional project, and the CICARA project, the Central American Caribbean project. But there are even 3 projects more, actually. So I would like to start with my introductory question, and this is one and the same question for all of you, so you can comment on it in sequence. Each of you has 3 minutes time, and then we will open the discussion to the audience. But you can always interfere whenever you want. So the question is actually, I think I can put it up here. What do you think that the completion and availability of the global earthquake model as it was presented today by Marco and Vitor, what does it mean to your organization, your stakeholders, and the projects you are in charge of?
Thank you. Should I start since I'm holding the mic?
Yeah, okay.
Well, congratulations to the team, Vitor and Marco. So it's been exciting to see everything here today. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I guess I'll speak on behalf of GFDR and then some of the operational teams that work for the World Bank, and then directly our clients that we work for, which are mainly in developing countries. And I think what we're sort of seeing being advocated in developing countries around this topic of disaster risk management is really this process of informed decision making. So really trying to think about working with countries, city level, national level, to think about if they're making investments in disaster risk management or in urban planning, that they're actually informed by risk data and information. And so I think what we're seeing now is when we start these dialogues, the first place that we try go to is really what data is available. And often it is turning to these global models. So I think it's, I mean, practically speaking, what we're seeing now is with the availability of this information, when we start having dialogues with clients, we can actually turn now to global models and global information and data and say, you know, this is robust, this is good information, this is dialogue that we can start discussing. If you have investments that you're going to be making or infrastructure, are you doing them in risky areas, and making these decisions. And I think that what's also exciting and a new sort of approach of doing things is really thinking about the fact that this is open, that it's available, that you're not seeing a lot of duplication of efforts, that people can use, reuse the data, share the data. And also it's presented in a way that's a good communication tool. So we're seeing things geospatially, we're seeing maps, we're seeing dynamic information, we're working in places that have massive urban growth and development and constantly changing situations. So being able to have these tools is very for our dialogue. In terms of going forward, I think the one thing that we'd like to see more, and I was very excited to see it in the presentations earlier by Canada, is this idea of coupling some of these approaches of having the data and the information with actual recommendations and solutions. So looking at what can you do with this data, what is the cost-benefit analysis of either looking at, are you going to be doing disaster risk management planning, evacuation, are you looking for a risk financing, risk transfer strategy, and really laying out the costs associated with that and bringing some solutions. So in summary, I'm very excited about this, and I think there's going to be a lot of demand for this work.
Thank you, Emma. I would like to turn over to Ricardo because he is also, on this global framework.
Thank you very much, Anselm, and I want to also echo Emma's and everybody else's congratulations to John and the whole GEM team for this incredible achievement. I think that we all have to celebrate this, and actually, as I represent the organization, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is the responsible organization for supporting the implementation of the Sendai framework, I have to establish some parallels between today and today's achievement with the Sendai framework, of course. Now, I can see that there are three very specific areas where this contribution by GEM fits with the Sendai framework. And I start with something that we don't refer to very often, but that's Target G, the global Target G of the Sendai framework. If you don't know what Target G is, it says substantially increase the access to multi-hazard early warning systems and risk information and assessments. And this is something that we are going to be asking countries to measure themselves, how much they have actually met this target. There is actually a specific indicator of Global Target G that talks about the accessibility or availability of risk assessments and risk information, including risk modeling, of course. There is a second area where I think that the contribution of GEM is fundamental, and that's related to priority 1 of the Sendai framework. I don't know if you recall correctly, but Sendai framework has 4 priorities of action, and it starts with understanding risk. And I mean, you cannot measure something that you don't have data for. So counting now with a global earthquake model is, I think, a great contribution towards a better understanding of risk by our constituents that are member states. And the third area is related to the role of the stakeholders themselves. Sendai framework talks very clearly about the fact that disaster risk reduction is the main responsibility of governments, member states, but it is a shared responsibility with stakeholders. And among the stakeholders, Sendai framework clearly also singles out science, technology, and research. And on that, I think that, again, if you look at what Sendai framework is asking from the stakeholders at the global level, it's precisely asking science and technology and academia to work on better understanding risk and developing risk models and risk information for better decision making by national, local level authorities. So it's a great contribution, of course, and I hope that we will have time to discuss a bit more about this, because we have to also bear in mind the whole scope of the Sendai framework, which now includes not only natural hazards, but also human-made hazards. Actually, the Sendai framework talks about man-made, but I'm gender sensitive, so I talk about human-made hazards. So we have to now ensure that countries actually take a broader view at risk, because we also know very well that risk, one, is it's not static, it's very dynamic. Two, it doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in an ecosystem that has many other aspects that enter into play. And therefore, we need to move forward to what we call the global risk assessment framework that combines all the possible hazards, all the possible combinations, and also the triggering effects and the cascading effects that one hazard can have in a very complex society as the one that we live in today. But I'm sure that we will have more time to elaborate on that. So I stop. My 3 minutes, I think, are over, so pass the mic to Dicky.
Thank you. Some really good answers there. So I think I still want to start by saying that the constituency that funds OASIS, that is the greatest user of OASIS, is the insurance and reinsurance community. And for them, GEM is a fantastic opportunity. And it's a fantastic opportunity for 2 or 3 reasons. So the first one is that actually, for the first time, we have the availability of the ability to look at seismic assessment on a global basis. So that's really important, because actually having gaps around the world is a real problem. If you're an insurance and reinsurance company or a broker, and you want to understand the risk in some part of the world, you need to know there are tools available in those parts of the world. So the first one is global coverage is fantastic. The second thing is that there's an element of standardization here. And as been described this morning, it's not uniformity, it's just a standardized approach to bringing the community together. So that's really, really important too. Thirdly, it's fantastic that actually you've got local buy-in to this. And I think this is something that has not been paid enough attention to over the years. I've just done some work in Bangladesh and the Philippines, and they love the idea that they are able to put these tools together themselves to begin to bring their own science community to bear. And I'm talking about other perils than earthquake here, actually, but the principle is the same. So I think that's really, really important, not only for the people that are using it, but for the reinsurance industry who want to have a conversation about risk, often with those countries themselves. So it's important that it has credibility locally. And then I think the last thing that I think is fabulous is the openness of the open risk framework, which means that GEM does not become the universal view of risk, right, which actually I think would be fixed, like you could never change it. It becomes a tool from which you can derive your view of risk. And that's a very important thing for the insurance reinsurance community. So you can use the base information, you avoid duplication of effort, you're using standardization, you've got local buy-in, but you can, if you want, take a different view about the tail risk, for example, using Open Quake, and build that into your system. And what OASIS does is it delivers that information in the format that the insurance and reinsurance community are used to, so it really helps. So we put the first model into OASIS, and we're just about to try and offer the whole community, insurance reinsurance community, the ability to do that, working with Malcolm, who's already been mentioned before, but other people can play a role in that too. So I think that's fantastic. And then, of course, I don't want to dwell on it, but it's really important for those parts of the world that haven't got the ability to do this. And GEM either provides just a framework, as many have already described this morning, or potentially, like in Bangladesh, where they're quite keen to have the GEM model in OASIS in combination with a cyclone model that's being built for them by an organization we're working with. So it's brilliant.
Well, I think the release of the new GEM products is going to have a significant impact for my organization and our stakeholders. From our organization, we mainly respond to disasters, including earthquakes, of course, but we do disaster risk reduction work as well. And we don't want to be too reactive, so when there's an earthquake, to then invest in DRR work. We'd like to be more proactive, and so having these global products are going to help us as an office to prioritize the work that we do. And for our stakeholders, who are ultimately people who are at risk from earthquakes around the world, I think it's going to be really beneficial. As a scientist, not a seismologist, but a scientist, I appreciate how rigorous the process has been and how scientifically accurate the GEM products are. But as a person representing a humanitarian office, I'm thrilled to see more simplified, accessible products that are being made available, such as the country profiles, that I think is going to make this more accessible to the communities that are at risk. And my hope is that GEM will continue to move along that path so that, as has been discussed earlier, these products can be accessed and risk can truly be reduced. Personally, I've been in discussion with GEM probably before 2009 about GEM happening, and I always envisioned there being a global earthquake model and maps that came out of this. So I feel really personally satisfied to see this happening, and I do think that that's going to create a great amount of demand and be an extremely useful product for many, many different groups.
Yeah, thank you all for your really excellent contributions and responses. This is very rich input for GEM to develop a plan to move forward. And with that, actually, I would like to open up the discussion to the audience. Are there any follow-up questions on the contributions of our panelists? I would say, as usually, this is not the case. Maybe I start just with a follow-up question. One aspect which has been mentioned by various of you is this multi-peril aspect. And so I would like to know from you, do you see really specific entry points for GEM to reach out into this multi-peril space, or strategies of GEM? I mean, you can approach this in a different way. Would you have some recommendations on that, or ideas, opinions?
Suppose I start because I'm the oldest in the panel, or, well, anyway. Yeah, well, I think, we value very much GEM's participation in the initiative I was just describing very shortly in my initial opening remarks, which is the Global Risk Assessment Framework. And I think that GEM's experience over these past 9 or 10 years in developing the global earthquake model are really invaluable for trying to assist other hazard groups replicate similar experiences so that we can start building really a comprehensive framework of different types of hazards that can use some of the data sets that have been made available already thanks to GEM's efforts with others that are also available by other partners. So we value GEM's experience in that area, and we also value very much their participation in this initiative. Actually, there are sitting in this very beautiful place 7 members of the expert group of the Global Risk Assessment Framework in addition to GEM. And we are promoting this initiative as a truly collaborative effort to try to change the way in which risk is perceived by people, particularly decision makers. And here I would perhaps like to open up by making an example. As I said, we live in a very complex society, and we have even, technologically speaking, very tightly coupled systems, and we also have a world that is more interconnected than ever. So something happening 5,000 miles away from a place can actually have an impact on that very specific place. And the same thing happens if you go to the local scale. So let's suppose a government is trying to incentivize the establishment of industrial entrepreneur activities in a given area, and that area actually happens to be located in an earthquake active zone. So you can say, okay, we are going to make sure that the buildings we build for our facilities are going to be following an earthquake resistant building code, and then issue is solved. Well, what about if that area is also flood prone? What would you do? And actually, nowadays, it happens that many of such facilities are actually built in areas that have a combination of hazards that are not only natural in origin, but also it may be that there is a gas pipeline going underneath, and there are consequences that could be triggered by a natural hazard that can create secondary effects like a big fire or landslide or toxic waste because of a technological facility nearby. So you cannot look at risk in a unidimensional way. And this is what the graph proposes to actually do, is to look at risk in a very comprehensive way using the systems perspective to really being able to develop information, risk information, that would be useful for decision makers to actually achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. That's the ultimate objective. So of course, I invite others to comment on this initiative because, as I said, it's a collaborative approach. It's very much a participatory and collective effort.
Yeah. Thank you, Ricardo. And Gary wants also.
Sure. So I think that GEM has two main features that really makes it amenable to addressing this multi-peril issue. One is that GEM has developed this excellent exposure and vulnerability data, and for all perils to figure out the risk, you need to use those data. And so one thing that USAID is supporting is looking at how the GEM data might be able to use for volcano risk. And there are many different perils that I think could also benefit from working with GEM and the data. The second thing is that the way that GEM goes about doing this by working with local communities to develop the risk and hazard information themselves. It's a model that we're very supportive of and think is sustainable, and we've seen the great results from doing it that way. And so I think that other groups that are focusing on their specific perils could really learn a lot from the lessons that GEM has learned along the way and benefit from trying to follow a similar model.
Thank you. I would agree with the two panelists with the assertion that we can't look at just earthquakes. We need to think about multi-perils, and we need to get everyone around the table to talk about things and share experiences. And I think the GEM framework that we saw today is an excellent approach at doing that. I'd also like to add that we are almost on the way of thinking about this in a multi-peril approach with the work that GFDR is doing with GEM on our data schema framework. So really thinking about how to create these uniform ways of collecting and sharing information on hazard, exposure, and vulnerability from a multiple peril perspective. So I think the building blocks are there, and I would definitely suggest that would be the way to go forward.
Can I maybe just add one point? So I think that's a really interesting question. It's a very difficult question. I think what's happening around the world is there are groups, communities, networks that are coming together to solve some problems. And we're seeing this extensively for obvious reasons in the climate space. We're seeing the insurance industry do this collectively. So the Insurance Development Forum is a good example of that. It's a way to try and create efficiency across all, both developed and developing countries. and issues like initiative, like Oasis, and many, many others. So I think the challenge that we all face, though, is that the space that we're in 3 years' time will not look like the space we're in now. So the most important element that we all have to take with us in trying to steer these organizations is maintaining dynamic aspects of those organizations to flex, to change, to adapt to a changing environment and changing marketplace. So I think that's the challenge we face, which is really hard. So, you know, if GEM was started today, would it look the same? Would you do the same thing? You know, I'm almost certain not. And therefore, we have to assume that that will still be true in 2 or 3 years' time. And that collaboration, that community aspect, and I think what you and ISDR are trying to do in curating, really, this graph initiative is a fantastic potential for trying to keep some of this information in one space that can help begin to do this, sort of shepherding this information. So I think the challenge for us is navigating these dynamic structures in the future to make sure that we have relevance and impact where it's most needed.
Thank you. This was, again, very useful and informative. I think we can leave the topic for now, because I assume we will come back to it in Jochen Schau's panel, because we have one representative for another Perl community, Roberto Basili from the Global Tsunami Model, in the third panel. Are now any further questions? I again open to the audience. Yeah, Nick Pondat, please.
Thank you very much. So yes, Nicolas Pondard from the World Bank. Just a quick question. If there is one thing you would like GEM to focus on next, what would it be?
I think, thanks, Nico, for the question. I think that, and this is a discussion that we've been having as a team at GFTR and the World Bank, I said this in my opening statements, it's really thinking about this level of going, okay, we have the data, we have the models, and now how are we going to help people, our users, our communities, our stakeholders with making those decisions? How do we provide solutions? How do we communicate that in a way that they can actually take decisions? And I think the process is, I think GEM has all the aspects of working with the user, that actually trying to understand what is the question and the challenge that the person you're developing these models and risk assessments for is trying to answer, going back, seeing if you can develop some sort of solutions together, and then if that approach doesn't work, building a new approach, and having that sort of user-centered design approach, I think would be key.
If I may, I think that there are lots of layers of additional data that would be extremely useful to add to the current model to try to better define what is the likely impact for specific sectors, particularly those that are contributing significantly to the production of gross domestic product in each of the countries. Of course, the immediate one that comes to mind is infrastructure. And as Victor presented today, the model still does not include specific infrastructure. And that would be, I think, a very important additional layer to be added to the system, because that would have in itself a very specific application and usefulness for the governments that may be subject to a disaster and an impact in that area. And then I liked very much Anna's presentation on what Medellin is doing with the power or electricity sector, which is another key infrastructure, if you want, on which a community depends a lot. Look at what happened in Puerto Rico after the hurricane, with electricity gone for not days, months in some areas. So to start supporting with information that can be used by decision makers in each one of the sectors to try to reduce the level of exposure in each one of the sectors.
I like those answers, they're really good, but that would be my second and third. I think the most important thing would be dealing with the lack of information on vulnerability. I think this is a global gap that we face across all hazards, And I think that it would be really important that GEM works with other organizations to make sure that we don't do something that's just for earthquake, that we do something for all perils that not only fulfills the needs of the insurance industry, but also, of course, of the Sendai framework. That, to me, would be the most important thing to focus on, as well as those two.
So when I was first talking to the GEM folks, and when GEM was being developed, it was described as being ranging from scientists to homeowners. And what I would like to see GEM do is focus more on the homeowners side of things and provide simple information that a layperson can access and use to reduce their risk. For example, something like they could put their address in, and of course, it's not going to show their house and the level of hazard right there, but it can give specific information about their hazard, and if they could perhaps pick their building type and give information about what they can do to better protect themselves. And perhaps that's not specifically GEM's role, but maybe partnering with local groups to achieve that sort of information, I think would be a really good way to go forward.
Thank you. Ian, how are we doing time-wise? Yeah. Are there further questions from the, yes? Ed, please.
Engineer from UK. I think GEM was possible because it was founded on a community of earthquake engineers that dates back to the International Association just after the war. And so it was a community of enthusiasms who did their job supremely well. You know, the need for multi-hazard has been emphasized so many times. So what does GEM do? Should it be a role model for others to follow? And should it just continue to develop what it's doing, which it will, you know, it can, it's got these wonderful people here, or should it be proactive and should it diversify? I mean, and there's the danger that then it dilutes itself. Well, what's your advice?
Well, I think that is a really tough question, and it's a good question for the governing board, and we have 2 days to sort that out. But I think, you know, the main focus is earthquakes, and I don't think we want to see that get diluted. I envision GEM kind of being more of a role model for other groups and to provide kind of technical assistance in how to get there, perhaps, but I mean, that's just my point of view, but it's definitely something that I think needs to be discussed further and decided upon as a group.
So I live in between the tribes of hydrologists, meteorologists, and seismologists. And like in most tribes, you have to be really careful if you want to take over another one. You're liable to get an allergic reaction. I actually think, without being so funny about it, you have to be very, very careful about reaching too far in this space beyond one's core sort of element of activity. So that'd be my so first point. I do agree that I think and I think fundamentally your comment about why the seismic community, GEM exists because the seismic community got together at a very early stage. It has a level of maturity as a community that is not as evident in other parts, in other spaces. So yes, it should be a signpost for others, but that doesn't mean you can follow the same formula, because if you're a hydrologist, you don't necessarily, you maybe need a different recipe. So we have to be very careful about how we assume we can learn lessons from GEM. We just need more solutions in other perils that we need to get solved.
I think it would be interesting if GEM is going to be that role model, and I think you've had 10 years of learning through this approach. I think some sort of discussion, open sharing information event on learnings, failures, what worked, what didn't, would be highly beneficial. And having that sort of open dialogue, so if we move forward into the space of multi-peril, then all of those lessons are really shared and learnt, and we don't make mistakes going forward.
Well, not really too much to add, but just to agree with Emma, I think that the process sometimes is as important as the product. So I think that what could be used in other communities is to better understand how the process went, what made it successful, what were the main challenges faced, and that could nurture other initiatives with other hazard or peril groups. And as I said beforehand, I think that because of the amount of work that still needs to be done just on the earthquake modeling, there is a lot of room for increasing the impact that GEM can have, looking at, you know, the other sectors, the other information, not to even start discussing about all the secondary effects that earthquakes generate, which enter into fire safety type of issues and standards and many other sectors. Of course, maybe the most, I would say, compatible sector could be look at what are the geological or geodynamic secondary effects of earthquakes, and see how GEM can meet with you know, other people's working on earth sciences to also discuss about how they did it, and how, for example, those dealing with earthquake-induced landslides or other geological or geodynamic hazards could work on.
Thank you. I think we can come to closing this second panel session. I really thank all the panelists and the audience for these very interesting questions, and not only questions, but really giving input and responses which we can use for our future work. I would like to make one final comment, actually. I mean, GEM would not start from scratch as regards approaching other peril communities. There have been contacts and even one challenge fund project, which is led by EGS, the Global Volcano Model, where GEM is also a partner. But by the way, I mean, this has shown how difficult it really is for various reasons. There are contacts to the Global Tsunami Initiative, to the Global Flood Partnership. I myself addressed the wind engineering community already 6 years ago. So we have been trying, but it's a major effort. It's really a major effort. Okay, so I'm closing the sessions. Thank you again. And I...